Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. So I'm happy to be back. So this will be the kind of conclusion of, I mean, there's a lot of things to discuss, but I had the tough job to just narrow it down to a few topics, right? So I'll just kind of I'll just give like a brief review of what we covered on Tuesday. And then today I was thinking in general, because like we could kind of go off in a few different directions, but I guess the direction I chose to go in was I was going to talk a little bit about the J-psi meson, because that's interesting and relevant for what we're discussing. And it relates to some of the other topics we talked about, like short range correlations and things like that. So just as our review from the last lecture, we want to bridge this gap between kind of our picture of nucleons and mesons in the nucleus. And we wanted to also, understand the connection then directly from calculations of QCD dynamics using quark-gluon degrees of freedom. And so short range correlations then, as we discussed on Tuesday, were really a unique insight into the QCD dynamics of the nucleus, because we know that they're related to the local density. And so we were able to see that they have kind of correlations and things in common with the observations we have of the EMC effect. They're universal to all nuclei from experimental data. They kind of dominate this high momentum tail. They're tensor dominated, so getting more PN pairs versus neutron-neutron or proton-proton pairs. And further studies in this area using spectator tagging, which are going to happen in upcoming experiments, may give us better clues anyways on the relation directly to the EMC effect. Okay, so we know that we have, short range correlated pairs. So they have small center mass, high relative momenta. And so then you would kind of get this nice picture here on the top left, such that if you have protons sitting in a neutron-rich nucleus, they speed up. This also has lots of interesting implications if you start thinking of neutron stars, for example. So people often want to basically go from this picture and to start describing into what's, the dynamics of what's happening in neutron stars. And then, of course, we know that basically we have NP pairing dominance. And so we have, the EMC effect, it can't be fully accounted for in a single model, today. And so this is kind of what this plot is reminding us of, is that we have, a full calculation with lots of different effects, and then we have the nuclear effects only, but we can't boil everything down to, a single idea. And so they're strongly linked to the local density, which correlates with the SRCs. So we can kind of develop sort of a model anyways to kind of quantify basically this universal kind of modification to due to short range correlations in the nuclei that would basically have all of the same effects for all different nuclei. And then, we saw also that, while the average density for nucleons is not necessarily the greatest proxy, but we know that kind of gave us the indication that the local densities are important, and the local densities, as they relate to short range correlations, we have this probability kind of factor here, which correlates very well with the EMC effect. So then that leads us to the questions, of course, is that are all the nucleons each modified a little bit in the nucleus, or are these just a few high momentum nucleons that are modified a lot? And so that's still up for discussion. So then we can kind of take the other road basically to explore QCD dynamics directly, where we would look at, the direct transition from quark-gluon degrees of freedom into the nucleonic picture. And so color transparency is a theory that it comes from QCD theory. It is a prediction of QCD. And it tells us it's sensitive anyways to this transition, because in electron-nucleus collisions, you would see it in basically the propagation of the proton in the nucleus. And so this tells us where factorization theorems are relevant, which is also important for things like GPDs. It's already assumed in a lot of high energy reactions. And so that's why I mentioned here it's the onset, but not the plateau that's important and interesting in terms of this transition that we're talking about. And it's generally been observed for mesons and hasn't really been established yet for protons. Okay. And so, this is just a reminder of what that transition would look like. So, in normal Glauber reaction theory, you would just have no transition, and then you have the onset of color transparency, which we would expect to see at some Q squared. And that's what we want to know, is what that Q squared is. And so on the top right, the results have not been seen in the protons out to Q squared 14, which is pretty high, and where we had a lot of theory motivation to be looking for it. And so we have hints, of course, from the mesons. It's not shown here as the rho meson, but we have the pi meson, where we start to see a little bit of a slope turn on at fairly low Q squared, right? So this is like at 2 to 4 GeV squared. And so maybe we just need to rethink the kinematics, because we're usually, for protons, we're working in parallel kinematics, such that the proton we knock out is already parallel to the Q vector. And so it's very, very clean, already has very reduced final state interactions. Okay, but today we're going to examine another route in kind of exploring this connection between the QCD land and real world. And so this could go, several different directions, but we'll just begin here. So there's sort of always this outlying question of, where does the proton get its mass, right? So we know that the mass basically emerges from this very complicated picture that we have of the proton. And so we know that the mass of the proton itself, it's far more massive than just the sum of the constituent quark masses. There's calculations that further so if you just account for the quark condensate, when you're just talking about the valence quarks and the virtual C quarks, then, you get some small contribution. If you start to try to apply kind of like uncertainty principle and kind of say what sort of mass, or rather energy, that you would basically get from these confined quarks, then you could get, a much more sizable contribution to the mass of the proton, but you're still nowhere near the mass of the proton. So that's where kind of that's where basically there's a lot of emphasis anyways in trying to understand how to make that calculation. And so if we could ask about the mass radius of the proton, we can we compare it to the charge radius? So we know last time, I think even on Monday, we were talking about the charge radius, right? And so if we have the charge radius of the proton is like 0.8 Fermi approximately, then where's the energy? How's that distributed inside the proton? Does it have a dense energetic core? Is it the same as the charge radius? Or does it have this halo that extends beyond the charge radius? And so, of course, this is all sort of driven, this discussion is all sort of driven by this enormous gluonic contribution and, in electron nucleus scattering. We want to know, how do we access that? How do we learn about the gluonic part? And so we can start to look for hints from things like quarkonium. So in this case, we're talking about the J-psi meson. So this was, it's, just as a broad thing, it was discovered separately by 2 different groups. That's why it has kind of the funny name, because they both discovered it pretty much at the exact same time and announced the discovery, but it was totally independent. So, so it's jointly called the J-psi meson, and it's interesting. So this is a CC bar charm meson, and so it's really interesting because it couples directly to the gluons. It doesn't arise from the light quarks. So that gives us really, it sort of can be used in this way. You can think of it almost like a probe. If you could just use the J-psi as sort of your probe to see the gluonic contributions, it can give you a lot of insight. And what's really useful to us is, as an experimentalist, of course, it has branching ratios into leptons. So a lot of the types of reactions that we talk about is we have, you can do it through electroproduction or photoproduction of this J-psi, and then it'll decay to an E plus E minus or a mu plus mu minus that you can detect. And in general, the electroproduction has a much smaller cross section than the real photoproduction. Okay. So Hall D at JLab does photoproduction, right? So this is Hall D down here in the corner, right? So you have an electron beam comes in on this diamond wafer, and then it makes basically coherent Bremsstrahlung photon beam, which then we can put onto hydrogen target or other types of targets, and we tag that with the electron beam. So then you can detect all the particles coming out of the reaction. So that's a nice way of using, this was a big motivator for the 12 GeV upgrade at JLab, was to be able to, do these kinds of, this kind of physics over in Hall D. And so one of the first, so they were the first basically to measure J-psi in, at JLab. And so this was their paper from 2019. So they saw basically, they constructed the E plus E minus invariant mass, and they have the peak at the 3.1 GeV here. And so they plot the cross section that they measure for the J-psi basically as a function of E gamma. And as you can see here, if all of their data is what's shown in black, you can see that this is what we call kind of the near threshold production regime. And so there's just not a lot of data before that in the near threshold regime. So this was really a big measurement. And so there's still some question on some of the normalizations, but this was a big step forward anyways in kind of kicking off this using the J-psi and establishing it at JLab as something that we measure and study. And so back to this discussion on some of the things that you can learn about from the J-psi. So you have the QCD energy momentum tensor, which would then give you information on the energy and the momentum, as well as the pressure. You can think of the confinement or the shear stress kind of forces due to the quark-gluon, quarking gluons in the nucleon. And so it's written this way, and there's sort of these four terms, these form factors, the gravitational form factors. And so, one is related to the momentum, one is related to the angular momentum, and the other is related to this, again, this pressure or shear forces. And so the idea is that if you could just take the cross-section anyways that you measure from J-psi, that's kind of your experimental observation, right? So you measure, you observe J-psi here, you measure the cross-section, and then you can basically start to then construct the gravitational form factors. And those can then be interpreted in light of theory. So I'm not going to spend this time period just talking to you this whole time. So I thought it would be more fun to actually read one of the most recent papers. This was a Hall C experiment that ran in 2019. And so I actually have hard copies printed of it. And I was thinking that you all could, it's not very long, it's just like 5 pages. So yeah.
Right?
Bergio, yeah.
She was also a Hughes student.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay. Yeah. So yeah, Bergio was a Hughes student. And so I was thinking that anyways that you guys could spend like, I guess it's not very long, so maybe we'll see what the time is, maybe like 15-20 minutes. You can read it. And if you want to do it in pairs or in like groups of 2 to 3, so you can discuss, I just posted some questions so you could discuss, and I'll be walking around. So I was thinking, so what? Okay, so yeah, so groups, so find whoever, if it's somebody just sitting next to you or you want to go somewhere else. I have these copies here. I did put it into the Slack channel. So if you want it on your computer because maybe you're not physically in the room or some other reason you just want it. So, but I do have, I think, enough copies for everybody here. So you can write on them. So we'll spend like 15-20 minutes, reading and discussing, and I'll walk around, and then we can come back and kind of share some of what we read about as a group. Okay. All right. So I think you guys are done. Does anybody want just a few more minutes, or we're okay? All right. Lost the thing. There it is. Okay. So I guess we'll start with question 2. So what were they trying to measure? I guess experimentally, what were they measuring? Cross sections, right? They're just measuring the J-psi photo production cross section. Okay. And then
extract the radius and the mass radius.
Mhm.
See the difference.
Yeah. So they have kind of this G term that sort of is like a catch-all, and then they can use that to use different models anyways to get the extraction in terms of the radius. Okay, so let's see. So the experiment in this case was set up in Hall C, which doesn't normally run a photon beam. So they used a copper radiator anyways to generate this photon beam. And so what was, I guess, the underlying message of what did we learn? What did we learn from this experiment? Does anybody? Yeah, right. Yep. So the mass radius was sort of much more dense and in the core. And then there was sort of this scalar radius, okay, which you can kind of think of as like the confinement. And that was bigger than basically the proton charge radius. So yeah, so this was kind of the setup. Basically, when you measure the cross section, you can kind of you're basically measuring it on T here. So T min is kind of where you would basically be generating the photon in the same direction as the J psi. And then this cutoff up here is where basically the J psi is like opposite direction to the photon. And so they took it in different measurements of T. So this experiment was kind of interesting because it didn't actually set out to measure this, right? The intention of the experiment was actually to measure the LHCb pentaquark that they kind of observed a few years back, right? And so that sort of has been, in general, kind of reinterpreted as sort of a, not a true pentaquark, not a 5-quark bound state, but as sort of a molecular composition of a 3-quark and 2-quark molecule almost. But so they were looking for anyways the T dependence. And so they found that this, this mass radius generated from the gluons, which were are basically kind of like really in the core, right? And then you have this this confinement, which is a little bit larger than the charge. And so this was pretty interesting. They compared it, so they extracted from their cross sections, they were able to kind of basically compare with the form factors, this A and D, and say that they had generally good agreement, but they kind of had some disagreement anyways with this. The green band was this this from a GPD extraction, which I think they talk about that extraction. Was it on like the second page? Right. So there's just some different built-in assumptions there, and they had a little bit worse agreement, which they might be chalking it up to sort of like a normalization or factorization issue. Okay, so then what does this look like over here, which is kind of nice to see. So you have E gamma, you have the radius that they extract here, which is somewhere around, 0.5, a little less. And, P rad, which we talked about on Tuesday, was over at 0.81. So the reason that J psis are also interesting, though, is because besides the fact it kind of gives us information about the gluonic part, you can ask the question, is there a gluonic analog to the EMC effect? And so you can basically be near threshold. So where threshold production is around, I think it's like 8.4 or so. So you can be near threshold, and that can tell you something about the EMC effect. If you put in a nucleus, like more than just a proton, so you have, some sort of bound nucleons, then because they have some sort of internal momentum inside of them, and larger nuclei, of course, have larger Fermi momentum, as we've seen, then you can start to generate J psi at what's called subthreshold, which means that as you're going basically as you're scattering off these higher and higher momentum nucleons in the nucleus, which we all know now are more likely to be in short range correlated pairs, then you're more sensitive to, then in this case with J psi, the gluonic contributions from an SRC, like a nucleon that would be in an SRC pair. Okay, so that's pretty interesting and can maybe even give us information about SRC universality, where we could ask the question, are SRCs responsible for the EMC effect across all nuclei in the same way? And so there's a pretty rich program at Jefferson Lab that, Hall B has data that they're going to extract for J psis. Hall D already had the first results and has more coming. And they could have they'll have a future with subthreshold, putting in nuclear targets. And kind of a big experiment that'll happen in Hall A is we'll have the solid experiment, in which case we can measure both electro and photo production with both measuring just the E plus E minus and then kind of measuring everything. So the electron proton and the E plus E minus. And so this is kind of the future way that we're going. So, we started off talking about SRCs and just what are they and nucleon knockout and that kind of thing. And now we're moving in the direction of, besides just quarks and nucleons, what can we learn about the gluonic contributions when these particles are overlapping? And so that's pretty much kind of what I wanted to share with you today. Did you have any more questions on this topic? This one? Yeah.
In the previous slide, I didn't completely understand like what you meant by a gluonic analog to the EMC effect.
Right.
Or this slide actually, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so the EMC effect, we're saying that the valence quarks, right, in bound nucleons are carrying less momentum than valence quarks in a free proton, right, or nucleon. And so the idea is, though, is that we're just talking about the quarks there. We're just talking about valence quarks. And so if we look a little bit deeper, is there a difference anyways in the gluonic densities distributions in bound versus free? Because, we don't actually know. Like up till now, we've just kind of been continuously doing the same thing on different nuclei and, trying to probe it in different ways. Now we sort of have this handle of short range correlated pairs. And so we sort of look down that thinking, because of local densities. So now the question is if you could actually probe the gluonic content, which is huge, right? And these things are, is there more information that could be gotten there? There's some predictions that say it's kind of small, that there could be an effect, but there's really no data that exists for it. So it's pretty unconstrained.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just in the plot of the A term for the gluon, see that at A of 0, it's roughly like 0.4 to 0.5, somewhere in between there.
Right.
Can you compare that at all with the quark content? Like, does it satisfy the usual sum rule of the total A term at 0 momentum transfer is 1?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know who's done these calculations or measurements yet. Just curious.
Yeah, since you're doing these kinds of calculations, you might look at these references and see if there's some you've probably seen them before or something, or
No, I haven't seen them for the
No?
JSI, but
okay.
yeah, and then a follow-up was it looks like the D term was always negative for the gluon?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know the full interpretation of that, but I think that was at least related to because they were so, yeah, I think that this at least was because they were so at near threshold. So I don't know exactly if they're like where your crossing is or what that means or something. So
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last?
I don't know if there's like where the crossing happens or what that exactly indicates, but
I know from how they try to relate the D term to like the pressure distribution, they define this like static energy momentum tensor.
So that's like this stuff.
And it goes as like, if you relate the D term to the pressure distribution, it's like R squared times the pressure distribution is roughly the D term.
Okay.
And so the pressure distribution, you normally have that like repulsive quark core and then the attractive pion cloud that dips under the attractive and repulsive pressure. And for the particle to be stable, that has to integrate to 0 over all of space. And since the D term has an extra factor of R squared, the negative contribution gets exaggerated a bit.
Okay.
And so the integral over the total D term tends to be negative. And they think that that's linked to the stability of particles. So whenever I see like a D term is negative, it's
interesting. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Other questions?
Yeah. Any other questions?
The only other question I had, sorry, was in your equation for the radius, the right-hand side looks Lorentz invariant, and I'm not sure. So is this a Lorentz invariant definition of a radius?
You're talking at the bottom of page, equations 1 and 2, right?
Yes.
I'm not sure, but they come from, let's see which reference they come from. Can check in the reference, I think.
Okay.
That's a good question.
I know they define like its transverse radius where the proton is sufficiently pancakey,
Right.
then the transverse radius is not going to change it as you boost.
Right.
So maybe that's what they're talking about.
That's a good question. Yeah, I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you.
Did you all like reading and discussing? Okay. Yeah, that's fun sometimes. Yep, go ahead.
Referring to their data as two-dimensional cross-sectional data, I was wondering what exactly were they referring to when they say two-dimensional?
I think they're talking about the T and the E gamma dependence, right? So that's why they have all these bins of E gamma, and then you're plotting it in T, and so you're extracting that relationship to then, because the form factors themselves need all of that information basically in both dimensions.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions here? Anything in general? Yeah.
What does it mean for the mass radius to be smaller than the charge radius?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's kind of hard to put together the intuitive picture. I guess I interpret it as like, they're sort of like this this core, right, with all these gluon. Again, like you think of like density, you think of all the gluon exchanges, and that's going on in the core. And then you think that the charge radius is more driven by sort of the relativistic motion of like these valence quarks, right? And then they have this kind of just general confinement, so it can eke a little bit outside the proton. So that's kind of the picture, I guess. I don't know if that helps at all. That probably doesn't help at all, but I think there's a lot more to be probably gained from like more studies on it, but that's just the initial, what's kind of emerging from this data.
Yeah, I think nobody has an intuition about that. So
Yeah, I
thanks.
don't really have one either. That's why I'm like, it's kind of, I don't know. It's interesting. It's a little confusing actually, but most quantum mechanics is kind of like that, so.
Fair.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is there another experiment where we can independently measure this in a different way as a verification?
The gravitational form factors?
This finding of the mass.
So yeah, I mean, there's other experiments that are gonna, I know like the Hall B experiments will probably have shed some light on this. I mean, I'm not an expert on the energy momentum tensor part of this extraction, but so there's definitely going to be more experiments that are going to measure more of these form factors. This is kind of a direction that a lot of people are going now, because we at least understand enough of, how the form factors work in other, in general scattering. And so now we can start to think about these kinds of things. In terms of, other types of things that we can learn with J-psi, though, I mean, we're directly kind of, I think there's going to be a big push even with the EIC, the electron ion collider, to look at J-psis and these kinds of particles that can probe the gluonic kind of contributions.
Yeah.
So that'll probably get some as well.
The diffractive production.
Yeah, and then there's like F long, like the F long structure function, right, is like also very sensitive to the glue anyways inside the, so I think a lot of these things they'll come from all different angles, and then they'll get put together, and then we'll have to kind of sit down and figure out again. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's it then. So thank you for having me.
March 20.